At what cost? Slow time. In this talk, we ask you to consider slowness in an age of acceleration. The core aspect of this audio experience is a contribution by Lydia Uraman. Her sonic playlist, Music to Sleep To, was commissioned as part of Chisenhall Gallery's online commissions in 2020. It was produced to encourage sleep, including field recordings made by the artist alongside a selection of songs and sounds, which will ebb and flow throughout this 20-minute segment. Ellen Grieg and myself, Hannah Conroy, will discuss our thoughts on the costs of slow time. In the wake of a pandemic where for many our work and home lives became intertwined and our social interactions reduced, we began to reflect on the speed in which our modes of production were set, as well as embrace and acclimatise to a new, perhaps slower, existence. It has been a time for reflection and to consider the aspects of what we do that matters versus what doesn't, against what is necessary and urgent to change versus what must stay the same. Many of us were able for the first time in years to evaluate and make resolutions for change. These weren't solely focused on curatorial concerns, but on a cohesive view of the impact of working, whether together or alone, in an organisation or self-initiated, alongside the other aspects of our lives, from family to passions and hobbies that keep us grounded and content, to weigh up what is living and what and how do we contribute. These new resolutions and reflections seem to be a daydream. As we gain momentum towards back to normal programming and producing, we are forced to pick up speed with ever-increasing workloads to drive the creative ambitions that compensate for lost time. As if we haven't learned anything from our period of entangled trauma and for some forced rest, we seem to have forgotten that we are still navigating a global pandemic and it isn't over yet. And crucially, that this pandemic has shown us that there is an urgency to imagine alternative ways of working, producing and sustaining the practices we hold dear. Before we begin our discussion, I would like to hold space for Lydia's contribution, which will form the backbone for the conversation. There'll be no visual aspects, so use this time to rest your eyes, get comfortable and allow the audio playlist to drift in and out of view as points of focus and reflection.
During the first UK lockdown, there was, and in many undefined ways still are, an urge for artists, art workers and the organisations that house us to stay visible or continue to engage with audience through making work for online distribution. At this time, while working from a dodgy laptop on a makeshift fold-out table next to my bed, I was thinking a lot about the pressures of production that we put on ourselves, especially in a pandemic, as well as speaking to many of my friends who are artists about the volume of cancellation of projects without any financial compensation, and how they cannot work and therefore cannot pay the rent or buy food. The inequalities of many of the structures that we live within became ever more visible in the wake of the pandemic, including that within our own work in the field of visual arts. In response to the necessity to distribute funds that were no longer going to be used for public events and exhibitions, I decided to program a series of audio commissions. The invitation to artists was simple: do something that does not take up too much time or energy, but feels generative. One of these commissions was by Lydia.
There are many starting points for this conversation, but I wanted to start with the idea of time itself and how we perceive it. We all know that time is relative, and it seems to speed up the busier we become, and it can slow down as we focus on small details such as breathing. But on a societal level, it is commonly accepted that we are working in an accelerated moment, where speeds of production and consumption set the tempo for our existence. This fast-paced environment dictates how we work and the balance of our daily lives. I recently listened to a TED Talk by Carl Honore, titled In Praise of Slowness, where he discusses the Western world's emphasis on speed, which erodes health, productivity, and quality of life. A combination of technology, workplaces, urbanisation and consumerism form parts of what Honore calls Western time, but he emphasises that how we think about time is the most corrosive aspect. Western time is linear, a limited source that is always draining away. Time is money. Use it or lose it. It is something that is depleting by the day, minute and second, and once it is gone, there is no time left. If time is considered to be scarce, then we need to get more out of it, and it becomes a race. This relationship to time is fraught, and it is understandable that this would cause anxiety and make time something that we compete with. To take this a little further, in cultural theorist Britley Cooper's research, The Racial Politics of Time and the Political Nature of Time, Cooper suggests that if time had a race, it would be white. Those with power, i.e. predominantly white people, continue to dictate the length of the working day, how much our time is worth, and the pace of social inclusion. Through the demand and incessant immediacy of right now, and the need to work harder, faster, and longer, means that the pace of productivity antagonises the slowness of equality. There is much more to read into this research that extends to the slowness of change and the endless complacency of being asked to just be patient and change will happen in time. But why not now? The changes that are urgently needed are slow, and because time is power, no one wants to give that up. In opposition to this white Western linear time, many cultures see time as cyclical, which is always renewing and refreshing itself. Seasons come and go, and for each missed moment or opportunity there is always a possibility to try again next year, or embrace a different season, context or situation. There is a stability in knowing that the universe keeps spinning, things change but also stay the same, and by living in the moment rather than in the past or future, which are both constructs, you can find acceptance and gratitude for everything that is in front of you, rather than on that which you do not have. Over the last couple of years, gardening really immersed me in a more cyclical way of looking at time, and the need for allowing dormancy in winter months to invest time in sowing and growing in spring, so that you can reap the benefits in autumn. Everything grown has a pace of its own, that you can't really force. If you were to treat every plant the same, giving it the same amount of sunlight, water, same growth expectations, you'd be really disappointed by the results. Instead, you plant some things earlier than others, you manage pests, and if a plant is doing badly, you don't blame the plant, but instead consider its environment. Through this adaptation to individual needs of the plants, you enable the ecology of the garden to flourish. As a gardener, I see my role as custodian, which enables everything to grow. Sometimes I input and support a bowing sunflower, or fertilise and pull out weeds, but generally everything is innately capable of doing what it has to do on its own, at its own pace, and I'm giving it a helping hand. I suppose it's a bit twee to reference gardening, but as a curator, I often work with creatives, directors, artists and so on, who have this false sense of mechanised productivity, as if they are able to continually deliver the same high level of productivity indefinitely. Without allowing points of reflection or wintering their thoughts and ideas, they're unable to gain the energy to flower in spring or be able to bear fruit in summer, because all the energy is spent in the unenviable task of keeping green and fresh continually, when conditions suggest that they should be dormant. It is a poor analogy, but I want to emphasise that in nature things stop and start again, months, sometimes even years later. But I regularly see galleries working tirelessly without pause, and I only see negative effects of this lack of reflection. I think it should be normalised to rest and work out your seasonal pace, that creativity has stages and isn't necessarily always continuous. Carl Honore talks about getting in touch with his inner tortoise and the lost art of shifting gears. which I'm trying to embrace when I can. I think through slowness and considering time from different viewpoints, there is the possibility to take power back and enable equality. In your role as senior curator at Chisenhale, you've worked with lots of artists and think about labour and time. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about that.
I first started to think about the relationship between work and time, and how our forms of clock time and natural time inform the way that we work. When I first started working with artist Imre Basiokan in 2018-19 to curate her Chisenhale Gallery commission. The show includes a sound piece embedded within a series of industrial fans that pushes the audio through the revolving, moving fans. There was a low hanging ceiling that cut through the space, holding these hand-cut glass lights that were filled with alcohol and oil. The light was warm and dim, and the space invited you to stay and wait, and importantly, pay attention. Imre and I talked a lot about language when developing this work. The use of the word tarrying in the title, for example, as well as the use of punctuation when spelling the word in the title, really stuck with me, and I feel it is an important part of how we develop this piece. It invites you to read the word in a certain way, excited and slow and disjointed. In a conversation we transcribed together, she explained the use of the word tarrying in terms of a stilted intensity of waiting, of slowing down, an intended dwelling on something, or waiting for something to arrive. She went on to say, everyone has a unique rhythm, and that rhythm comes from how we communicate, like through a stutter or a pause. I thought a lot about the word productive during this project also, what it means to produce and how we go about it, what is work and what isn't work. Much of our work as curators is to produce, and I often explain my role as a producer rather than a curator actually. But perhaps productive has been claimed far too much by the exploitive nature of capitalism, so we need to think for another term, like generative. Perhaps, although not always adequate and sometimes contradictory, a piece of art like Imre's can become a space for generative feeling. Today's precarious labour conditions are controlled by a fragmented and powerful temporality, periods of inactivity, redundancies, retraining, part-time and multiple employment. Furthermore, the consequences of the pandemic on economic activity, employment and labour conditions continue to have considerable effects on humans' lives globally. Structural inequalities and exploitive working conditions disproportionately faced by women and workers of the Global South are now more visible than ever, and the economic fallout is deeply felt. Those who can work from home are faced with negotiating an intimate relationship between work time and free time, clocking into and out of work in the domestic sphere. Meanwhile, the world's billionaires increased their fortune by 54% during the first year of the pandemic. Under these conditions, and in a world so structured by working hours and weeks, can we reimagine time extracted from productivity? Can a renewed relationship to time and work, one that is more democratic, joyful and ethical, lead us to a greater sustainability and equality? How can we slow down and make space for recovery?
So if we go back to the title of this segment, I want to discuss the at what cost aspect. I suppose this draws back to my initial thoughts on the scarcity of time. Me being the practical person that I am, always looking for pragmatic solutions or ways that we can step towards slow time. I am lucky enough to inhabit an independent perspective as someone who is freelance, who recently left a role co-directing a project space to take on personal development. I have the freedom to analyse the aspects of the arts here in London and have seen a drastic change in publicly funded arts over the past 15 years, with reductions in funding since 2008 recession, which is now being compounded by layoffs and further needs for private funding and alternative forms of income to support programming. I see fewer roles in institutions, and the ones I do seem to be asking for 3 roles in one, with expertise in marketing, fundraising, programming, patronage and many other strings to your bow. Salaries are pretty much the same, but expectations on staff and programming keep accelerating. From a personal perspective, I've seen a wonderful increase in the authentic engagement and education aspects that stems from many funders' core principles, Arts Council England being one. But somehow there is still a lot of commonly accepted unpaid, low paid work. We all seem to be complicit in an unregulated market, and as much as I love the grey areas that the creative industries reside within, I feel inherently that it continues to and always will be an unethical game. Together, you and I have discussed at great lengths ways to consider the arts, and particularly institutions, as a means to introduce radical care within programming. We have discussed cooperative and ethical approaches that allow for slowness and start to pace down this consumption-led, low-wage, more-work art world we find ourselves in. Art has always been a commercial enterprise, but if we are basing the development of future ways of working on business models, fast-paced modes of capitalism, and the system that struggled to survive during the recent crisis over the last decade, then how on earth are we to survive any forthcoming environmental and economic catastrophes? There is an urgent need to change and adapt, but the question is how and whether they will. I suppose, to get to the point, I want to think about what perhaps are initial steps for change. Key ways that we as gatekeepers between artists and audiences and institutions can actively change and encourage slow time that has a better work-life balance.
There are some interesting and very compelling campaigns for shorter working weeks, like a 4-day week. These arguments for working less are also feeding into fights for environmental and social justice. I think we will see some sectors implementing 4-day weeks in the next few years. I think in the cultural sector we have a problem with the love what you do myth. It is in some ways complicated and other ways totally clear that loving one's work will lead to more happiness, or perhaps in reality it often leaves you exploited and perhaps exhausted. The myth of loving your job in the cultural sector has directly fed into the competitive and elitist structures that we work within, unfortunately. Perhaps we just have to become better collective organisers. As Murray Bookchin said, workers have always been more than mere proletarians. Workers are also parents who are concerned about the future of their children, men and women who are concerned with their dignity, autonomy and growth as human beings, neighbours who are concerned about their community, and empathetic people who are concerned with social justice, civic rights and freedom.
At What Cost? Slow Time was recorded in September 2021 by Ellen Grieg and Hannah Conroy. Thank you for listening.